The political storm in New York City is reaching a boiling point as critics of Mayor Mom Donnie gather outside his residence, demanding his resignation. Protesters wave American flags, accuse the mayor of abandoning his responsibilities, and call on state leaders to remove him from office. Their anger stems from what they describe as a failure to address rising crime, political extremism, and the growing sense that city leadership is disconnected from the concerns of ordinary residents. To them, the mayor is not focused on fixing New York's problems, but on advancing a political agenda that they believe threatens the city's future. What began as frustration has now evolved into a full-scale movement demanding accountability from the city's highest office.
The controversy exploded after the mayor announced a new initiative aimed at targeting neglected properties throughout the city. On the surface, the proposal sounds reasonable. Identify poorly maintained buildings, hold owners accountable, and improve housing conditions for tenants. But opponents argue that the plan goes much further than that. They believe it creates a pathway for the city to seize privately owned buildings and transfer them to government-approved organizations. For many property owners, the announcement was so shocking that they initially assumed it was fake news. The idea that the city could aggressively pursue ownership transfers raised immediate fears about government overreach and the future of private property rights in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world.
Supporters of the plan argue that New York is facing a housing crisis and that neglected buildings should not be allowed to deteriorate while residents suffer. However, critics insist the city is ignoring the root cause of the problem. Many of the buildings being targeted operate under strict rent regulations that limit how much landlords can charge tenants. These buildings often generate far less income than market-rate properties, making major repairs financially difficult. Property owners claim that renovation costs continue to rise, while rent increases remain tightly controlled, creating a situation where investing in repairs can become economically impossible. According to them, the city is now punishing owners for conditions that were created by the very regulations imposed upon them. The mayor's plan includes the possibility of transferring ownership of chronically neglected buildings to nonprofits and community organizations. While supporters view this as a practical solution, opponents see it as a dramatic restructuring of the housing market. They argue that privately owned properties could gradually be shifted into the hands of organizations funded or supported by government programs. Property managers who currently oversee these buildings could lose contracts and jobs as ownership changes hands. Critics warn that such a transformation would not only affect landlords, but also thousands of workers connected to the real estate industry. To them, the proposal represents a fundamental shift away from private ownership and toward a more centralized housing system. One of the most heated debates surrounding the issue involves the cost of renovations. Property owners point to examples where private landlords renovate apartments for a fraction of what government agencies spend on similar projects. In one case, a privately funded renovation reportedly cost tens of thousands of dollars, while comparable government projects were said to cost hundreds of thousands. Critics argue that replacing private management with government-backed organizations could dramatically increase costs while delivering fewer results. They question how housing can become more affordable if renovation expenses rise significantly after properties are transferred out of private hands. Another major concern involves the city's enforcement strategy. Opponents claim that increased inspections, higher fines, and stricter compliance requirements could create financial pressure that pushes struggling property owners into bankruptcy. They argue that if buildings already operate on thin margins due to rent regulations, adding more penalties will only accelerate their decline. Once owners can no longer keep up with expenses, critics believe the city will have an easier time justifying ownership transfers. Supporters reject this interpretation, insisting that stronger enforcement is necessary to protect tenants and ensure safe living conditions. Nevertheless, the fear of excessive regulatory pressure remains one of the central arguments against the plan. The debate has also reignited broader discussions about rent control and housing policy. Critics argue that rent regulations intended to keep housing affordable have unintentionally discouraged investment and maintenance in older buildings. They point to situations where landlords spent large sums on approved renovations, only to receive far smaller rent increases than originally expected. In their view, constantly changing rules create uncertainty and make long-term investment risky. They believe this system discourages property improvements and contributes to the very neglect that city officials are now attempting to eliminate. Supporters of rent regulation counter that tenant protections remain essential in a city where housing costs continue to soar. Underlying the entire controversy is a larger ideological battle about the role of government in society. Opponents characterize the mayor's policies as an attack on private ownership and free enterprise, arguing that they prioritize government control over individual initiative. They contend that private property creates economic opportunities, encourages investment, and allows communities to thrive independently of political institutions. Supporters of the mayor's approach see things differently, arguing that housing should be treated primarily as a necessity rather than an investment vehicle. They believe stronger public oversight is needed to prevent exploitation and ensure that housing remains accessible to ordinary residents. Critics frequently point to existing government-run housing systems as evidence that expanding public control may not solve the problem. They note that city-managed housing developments already face maintenance backlogs, vacant units, and budget challenges. If current public housing struggles to meet demand, they ask, how can the city successfully manage thousands of additional apartments acquired through ownership transfers? Supporters respond that reforms, additional funding, and partnerships with nonprofit organizations could address these shortcomings. The disagreement highlights a fundamental divide over whether government intervention is the solution or part of the problem. As protests continue and legal challenges loom, New York finds itself at the center of a national debate about housing, property rights, and the future of urban governance. Supporters believe the mayor is taking bold action to confront a housing crisis that has left many residents struggling. Opponents view the same policies as a dangerous expansion of government authority that threatens private ownership and economic freedom. With both sides deeply entrenched, the battle over the city's housing future is far from over. What happens next could reshape not only New York's real estate market, but also the broader conversation about how cities balance affordability, regulation, and individual property rights in the years ahead.